Good morning, and welcome to Connections Radio Show, where we talk about ideas that matter. I'm glad you've made the connection and are with us today. I'm Laurie Fitz, your host, and the goal of our show is to explore a wide range of topics that challenge us to see ourselves, our community, and the world around us in ways that get us thinking, get us connected, and perhaps inspired or challenged to do just a bit more because we've made the connection. Today, we continue our series on Jewish voices, and today's show will be featuring a movement group founded by Israeli expats here in the U.S. who are standing up to save democracy and human rights in Israel. We're focusing on how ordinary citizens can come together and make a difference in the fight to preserve democracy, both here and in Israel. And we're grateful for the efforts of Kit Bix, our producer of the Jewish Voices series. And on our show, we have John Orenstein, who is J Street's co-chair of Minnesota.
That's right. Thank you.
Absolutely. Glad you're here. We've got David Myers, who is part of the leadership team of UnXeptable, and Ophir Gudelson, who is also the co-founder of UnXeptable. Welcome to all. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Absolutely. Ophir, you have gotten this wonderful movement going. You're one of the co-founders. I understand you started this in July 2020. Tell me a little bit about your goals and your purposes of UnXeptable.
Thank you so much for having us. Before we even start, I really want to say thank you for being here, but also want to say also that our hearts and our thoughts are right now with our family and friends and everyone who is in Israel right now going in and out from bomb shelters. So we are thinking of them, and now we can kind of like start to talk about why we are so connected and what we are doing in UnXeptable.
It's powerful times.
So UnXeptable actually started in 2020 during COVID, when we learned that there will be that Benjamin Netanyahu is going to run for election as an indicted prime minister, and there was basically a group in Israel that was protesting, saying that it's going to be unacceptable to have an indicted prime minister. And that's kind of like how we got our name, and it started in a very simple way where I called people to come out to the bridge. If you remember, this was after the George Floyd and the BLM rallies here, and also in Israel there was election and Netanyahu won, and everyone was keeping distance, and still they went out for rallies, and Netanyahu, as part of his point of limiting the protests, he told people to not go away to Jerusalem to protest, but to stay very close to home, like 1,000 meters. So Israelis went to protest on the bridges near their towns. And we had an idea here that says like, well, we have like a little bridge called the Golden Gate Bridge, and we can probably find a spot there. It's open in the air, no problem of getting together. And that's how it started, and it then expanded very quickly. Like things happens between Israelis when someone hears something, someone is doing something through the Israeli media, then they reached out, and that's how UnXeptable started to spread nationwide to over 25 chapters.
Well, as I read through some of your website, I was taken aback and moved by the recovery that you talk about from the years of divisiveness, the culture of corruption, the fear, and the difficulties in being able to promote democracy and to hold on to the rule of law.
Yeah, so our principles are very clear. I mean, our focus is really about being a big tent around saving Israeli democracy. And Israeli democracy is the definition of what we see in the Declaration of Independence that happened not too far away, less than 80 years ago. And the rule of law, when you have an indicted prime minister, as he himself said back at I think in 2008, when he was opposition leader to back then Prime Minister Olmert, that an indicted, even not indicted, just have suspicions around the prime minister, he will take the wrong decisions that will only be relevant to what is important for him personally and not for the good of the country. So this became the focus, but over time, this has expanded into much more, because we have seen once the new government launched in 2023 that they have much more appetite than just worried about democracy. They have the appetite to annex the West Bank, and they have the appetite to turn Israel to a more closer to a more messianic theocracy or Jewish fundamentalist theocracy. And that's where we understood that we have to bring also more people to the game, which were the Jewish community locally here, that understanding it will impact them.
So bringing all voices together and saving Israeli democracy. I also love that part of your goals are to have an inclusive movement that fosters kindness towards diverse communities. I think that's quite beautiful as well.
Yeah, I mean, the one of the things that we learned over time is that first of all, I mean, like, there is many reasons why people would want save Israeli democracy. It can come from human rights. It can come from the reason of LGBTQ, the Arab citizens of Israel, inclusiveness. But also when you think about in general, I mean, the voices even here. I mean, some people believe that Israel needs to be saved in one way, and some people in another way. So the idea of big tent and inclusiveness was crucial to make sure that, again, not just Israelis are welcome, Israeli expats, but also Jewish American, not just Reform, but also conservative. So, and obviously, very, very important, it's for any Israeli, not just Jewish.
I read something about you, about how you've created a new town square where Israelis and American Jews who are not accustomed to working together gather for a common purpose and bridging the gap. And I love that you referred to the Golden Gate Bridge, and bridging the gap has become possible by reaching out to Jewish institutions and developing personal relationships. What I think is a challenge for us here in America is that so much of us don't really understand the Israeli government. I have John Ornstein, who is the co-chair of J Street, Minnesota. And what do you think? Do most Americans really understand where we are with understanding the Israeli government and how it works?
Well, I think so much happens in Israel every day that requires media attention. You know, today it's something happened in the Iran war. Yesterday it's something that happened on the West Bank. That there's really no room for sitting back and getting kind of a basic civics lesson. Mm-hmm. You know, what kind of democracy is Israel? How is it different from ours? Does it have like the same branches of government? Mm-hmm. Who are the Israelis? There are things that just don't get the media attention, and so they're kind of lost in the storm of daily activities. And that's why I'm going to bring David Myers into the conversation. David is on the leadership team of UnXeptable. David, can you give us just this is asking a lot, I think, but kind of a quick civics lesson about Israeli democracy? The kinds of things I'm thinking of are, you know, what kind of democracy is it? Does it have the same branches of government that we have? Is the judiciary important in Israel the way it is in the United States?
Sure. I will try to do all of that in a few sentences, and thank you for having me as well. Israel is a parliamentary democracy somewhat modeled on the British system, but with a single house, the Knesset, instead of two, with 120 members. The executive and legislative branches both emerge from the Knesset election. So there's not a separate election for the prime minister or certainly for the cabinet officers. The president is a figurehead, somewhat analogous to the monarch, let's say in a constitutional monarchy, who has rather limited powers, but a few very important ones, including what's in the news today, the power of the pardon. The judiciary is independent, or is supposed to be, and that's a lot of what we are fighting about and fighting for over the last 3 years. Sorry, did you want to ask a question?
No, go ahead. You're doing great.
Okay, it is a multi-party system, and so when elections are held, each party gets a number of seats or mandates, as we call them, out of the 120. And then the president, one of his important responsibilities is to assign one of the party's leaders to form a coalition. Usually it's the party that got the most votes. But just because a party gets the most votes does not necessarily mean that it has the ability to form a coalition. And sometimes one party will receive the opportunity to form a coalition and fail, and then a different party will get a chance. And we've seen that go back and forth in recent years, even several times. One really important fundamental thing about Israel is that there's not a constitution. As Ophir mentioned, we have a Declaration of Independence that stated the key principles at the founding of the state, but those are not embedded in a constitution that has the superiority of the Constitution in the US over laws. So it's relatively easy for the legislature to change laws. There are some things called basic laws, but it's not like the Constitution where it's very hard to change, and therefore kind of slows the role, if you will, of the legislature and the executive in changing laws as they want to.
And in a way, it enhances the role of the judiciary, doesn't it?
Yes and no. So there's been, much like in the U.S., it was, I think, close to 250 years ago when the question of judicial review of laws came up in Marbury versus Madison, if I remember my civics. And here that conversation happened about 30 years ago, and there is judicial review of laws, but that's one of the things that is contested right now.
Okay.
One of the things that I just wanted to make sure I understand as well, you don't vote for a person, you're voting for your party. Is that correct? And then it's the party that makes the decisions of who then gets put in the various roles.
That's absolutely correct. So when the parties arrive at elections, they have a list. So you know who is first in the party. The mechanism by which they determine that varies actually by party. Some of them have primaries that are fairly similar to what you would see in the US. In others, it's decided by some sort of central committee. Right now, one of the things that many of our allies are advocating for are that parties have what we call a zipper, meaning that if the first in the list is a male, and the second is female, the third is male, and so forth, to reach gender equality in the parties. And then there are parties with no women. So each has different mechanisms of selecting the list. And then if a party gets 10 mandates, 10 seats, the first 10 on their list will be members of the parliament.
And let me ask you this. Because Israel, its population, excluding the occupied territories for the moment, is something like 20% non-Jewish, is that right?
Yes, a little more.
That makes for a distribution of power that people outside of Israel might not expect. So in a government that relies on coalitions, Druze and Palestinians and other non-Jewish groups pull some weight, don't they?
They do, and this is one of the key factors. I know Ophir will talk about more for this election and more for our efforts. There are a couple of parties, a number of parties that are traditionally Arab, and parentheses, just because they're Arab parties doesn't mean that Arabs have to vote for them. They can vote for whomever they wish, and other people, Jewish people, could vote for Arab parties. And for most of Israel's history, they have not been members of the coalition. There is an embedded political resistance, but not a legal resistance or barrier for them to be parts of coalitions. It did happen a couple of cycles ago under a Netanyahu government that one of the Arab parties was part of the coalition. I think we'll get deeper into it, but one of the sort of political arguments is, do you form a coalition with the Arab parties or try to just get them to sort of what they call support from the outside? So support one of the sides, but not be a member.
Just to correct you, David, I mean, it wasn't under Netanyahu, it was under Bennett.
Yeah.
Which was a few years ago, right?
Yeah, this was a few years ago, and that was probably the second time that a liberal Democrat coalition was relying on the Arab population, Arab parties' votes and it was first time in the Rabin coalition when in 95, 93. And then basically only 30 years later, less 40 years, almost, I don't know, 30 years later, with the coalition of Bennett and Lapid.
So out here in non-Israel land, we hear it's all about Bibi or not Bibi. And I'm curious, in some sense, maybe that's true. But in another, it sounds like if he wins another election, he still has to deal with a coalition of these very diverse groups. Is that the right way to look at this?
So it is.
go ahead.
The coalition, the upcoming, if you look on polls in Israel, what you will see usually is that the polls are basically differentiate between the coalition and the opposition to Bibi, right? So the opposition to Bibi, to Netanyahu, is Prime Minister Netanyahu, is basically any party that is not in the coalition today, which has 68 seats. Just to add on what David said, again, in the Knesset, in the Parliament of Israel, there is 120 seats, and you need to get obviously more than 60 to get approved as a government after the election. And now Netanyahu has 68 people in his coalition. And in any polls in the last 2.5 years since the judicial overhaul was launched, even more than that, he's not going through 50, 51, 52 seats. So it's a huge difference of popularity on the coalition side. So to your point, I mean, it will not be only Bibi or not Bibi, because it will actually be much bigger than that now after October 7. It will be like what we call those who believe in the sanctity of life, in a way, to those who are more focused on the land and the expansion of the land and bribe and corruption. So that's how we look into it. And I would just say that until the judicial overhaul, and we probably can, when we went on the streets, our camp was mostly divided. Sounds like center-left comparing to right?
Yes.
And post-judicial overhaul, when we went on the streets, and we can probably make some paralleling it to what's happening also in America, this camp is now calling liberal Democrat camp. That could be from people from the right, which is, let's call it Bennett and Lieberman parties, all the way to the left to Yair Golan and the Arab parties.
Well, thank you for giving us a sense.
Can I just add one thing
Yes.
Just one foundational thing about the coalition that Netanyahu has put together and that forms his base and chances for re-election is that there are kind of three parts. There is his core, call it the right wing, mostly traditional, secular, or somewhat religious people. They're the ultra-Orthodox, who he keeps in his coalition through very specific sectoral interests of theirs that he serves. And then what he did in the last election that kind of kicked off the judicial overhaul and a lot of what we're seeing now are the extreme right parties looking for annexation of the West Bank, full settlement of the biblical land of Israel, et cetera. So he keeps those three parts together, and that's what forms his base of the Bibi side of that equation, so to speak.
And that's how the system allows what we think of as extreme groups to have extreme power in Israel. It sounds like, if you're outside of Israel, you don't know much about the population, you think that there are all these settlers and messianic folks, and that must be a majority group in Israel because they seem to be dictating policy. That wouldn't be the case, would it?
That's correct. It's fairly new in the last few years. In other words, there's been some deals, let's say, with the ultra-Orthodox or catering to various constituencies. But again, because of the reasons that Ophir will discuss, and judicial overhaul, and Netanyahu's own political and legal jeopardy, he essentially gave away the farm in a way that even other right-wing governments would not in the past to these sectoral interests.
And with that, I'll have to have us go to our break. But I'm anxious to hear more about how this authoritarianism and the challenges that we're facing both here in Minnesota, our country, as well as in Israel. So we'll be right back. But before I go, I want to make sure folks know how to get to their website. UnXeptable is UnXeptable.org, UnXeptable. And thank you for joining us on Connections Radio Show here on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. We'll be right back. Good morning and welcome back. I'm Laurie Fitz. And we're so glad that you've joined us on Connections Radio Show, where we talk about ideas that matter. Today, we are continuing our series with the Jewish Voices, and we have been featuring a movement group founded by Israeli expats here in the U.S. who are standing up to save democracy and human rights in Israel. We're focusing on how ordinary citizens can come together and make a difference in the fight to preserve democracy, both here and in Israel. And we're grateful for the efforts of Kit Bix, who is our producer of the Jewish Voices series. For our show today, we have John Orenstein, who is the co-chair of J Street, Minnesota, David Myers, part of the leadership team of UnXeptable, and Ophir, who is a co-founder of UnXeptable, joining us. We were just talking about how the government works in Israel, some of the challenges in our last segment, and we started to talk about authoritarianism, John.
Right. In a way, it's the flip side of democracy. We talk about democracy, but in 2026, throughout the world, we see democracies at risk of becoming autocracies and authoritarian systems. It seems that UnXeptable puts that concern at the core of their work, and that UnXeptable is vigorously opposed to the Netanyahu regime. Can you tell us more about that? What you see as the risks or the realities of authoritarianism in Israel today?
So I would first want to add, for everything we've just said, that we are very, what we call pro-Israeli in that sense. That means that we are there to make sure, as we said, that we save Israel and Israeli democracy. And when you oppose, and many times when you think about opposing Netanyahu, you think that you are against Israel. So we just need to make sure and make clear that we do that. In that sense, when you fight against authoritarianism, I mean, again, similar to what's happening in America, right? When you fight against it, doesn't mean that you are against the country. And that's very, very important, because there are many reasons to believe that when you fight for, authoritarianism is a playbook that is being used in many, many different countries, from Hungary to Venezuela to obviously what we have seen in the early 30s in Europe and so on. But in Israel, but every place in different countries, it has different motivations, right? Why do you want to get there? In Israel, the motivation right now is a conjunction of three main reasons. One is there is a small group of settlers who live in the West Bank, who many of them was moved out. Some of them moved out from Gaza back in the disengagement, back in 2007, I think 2005, sorry. And they know that they don't have the majority in Israel, right, to do what they want to do, which is expanding the country, expanding the land, led by the idea of the whole land from Iran to all the way to Egypt was gave to Israelites back in the Bible time. So they have one motivation, and they know that it's impossible to do it with checks and balances of the court, right? It's just not possible, because one of the things that when you want to save Israel as Jewish and democratic is that you need to make a decision about 5 million Palestinians. Just to remind people, there is 10 million Israelis on the what we call in the outside of the West Bank. 8 million of them are Jewish, 2 million of them are non-Jewish, and then you have another 5 million, right? So between the river and the sea, there is half Jewish, half non-Jewish Palestinians, mostly Muslims. So if you want to annex the territory and not give rights, if you give rights to everyone, equal rights, then you are basically losing the status of the Jewish part of the Jewish and democratic. And if you don't give the rights, and if you give the rights to everyone, then there is a chance you will lose the part of the Jewish part and only be democratic, right? So that's one motivation of authoritarianism in Israel. The other side of it is equality, right? We have the ultra-Orthodox who are basically trying to get themselves out of drafting to the army. And they, again, I mean, for many, many years they were succeed. And now there is this moment of time where the judiciary is forcing the government to put equality on everyone. So authoritarianism, and then there is the court that basically is supposed to judge Netanyahu, which is now in trial, and the Supreme Court will probably most cases this trial will go to the Supreme Court.
Can you stop there? Can you stop there for a second? Judge Netanyahu
Sure.
For what?
So Netanyahu is indicted for 3 crimes: bribery, breach of trust, and the third one is something around that.
Fraud.
And he's mostly trialed. Most of his trials is about trying to influence and take control over the media, right? Which we will talk. We can see the relation to what's happening in America as well and other places. He basically tried to get different media outlets to do what he wants in exchange to regulatory benefits. So that's what he's mostly on trial. While again, in many of us here, if they just listen to the news and don't go into the details, then they will think about it's a Bugs Bunny or some cigars and champagnes, and obviously that's what President Trump is pitching, and that's why he should get pardoned, because it's just not a ridiculous trial. But in the end, it's about his understanding that without control over the media, it will be very hard for him to turn Israel to be what it is today.
Yeah, I look at what's happening here in America with Brendan Carr, the chair of the FCC, threatening to have our broadcast licenses be not renewed if we do not report favorably about the war in Iran. So we're dealing with similar struggles, not the same, but different. But they have their roots in democracy. And people don't often know about the massive protest movement that goes back to 2023 in Israel. And you supported those Israeli protests by holding protests here in the U.S. Ofer or David, whoever would like to respond to that?
David, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, at the beginning of 2023, the newly elected, at this time, government, Netanyahu's coalition, embarked on a very aggressive, what they called reform of the judiciary. We call it a judicial coup. And it really meant to pull out many of these supports, if you will, of Israeli democracy. A groundswell of grassroots activism started, or I'd say exploded in Israel from some previous seeds from previous protests. And we joined here mostly to give them, as we say, a tailwind, to just let them know that they're supported. They were out there every week in the rain, every Saturday night protesting. One of the things they did, which I think is relevant here, is they reclaimed ownership over national symbols like the flags. You would see thousands and thousands of people out there with the Israeli flag protesting against the government and for democracy. And we wanted to get behind them. But what we also discovered is that we had a specific voice that mattered in that conversation. And UnXeptable grew very quickly to worldwide. So Israeli TV would show that around the world, Israelis and Jewish communities were also protesting against this judicial coup. And one of the areas specifically from the US, and even more specifically from where we sit in Silicon Valley, was what the impact would be on the so-called startup nation, on Israel's high-tech sector, because many of us here are part of that. People go back and forth. They're in Israeli-founded companies. but working in the US. And so it became not just kind of helping them and showing moral support, but actually having a voice in that conversation in Israel that enabled people to think about the costs to them, to their families, to society, if this judicial coup went through.
And Ophir, you mentioned how similar you felt that the Minneapolis protests were to the Israeli protests.
One of the key elements that we have seen is what we call the solidarity in those protests. And the idea that in many ways, before the judicial overhaul started, there was this notion that liberal Democrats in Israel are just fading away. We are not the majority. We are just kind of like becoming one of the what we call the center, and we don't have opinions, and so on and so on. And then this moment where Minister Levin, the justice minister, basically announced this judicial overhaul was kind of like igniting this local movement in Israel that basically went out every week, probably over hundreds of thousands every week for 39 weeks, over and over again. I mean, like to what we might look at today here in America as the No Kings, but imagine that every weekend, every week from January to just the night before October 7th. And so this idea was actually, so if you think about it, when UnXeptable started, it was during the time where very much there was the BLM rallies as well in America. And you can think about the difference of those rallies comparing to the rallies against ICE in comparison, right? And that was kind of like what I see when I look at the difference between the rallies that we did in 2020 and the rallies and UnXeptable is not organizing those rallies in Israel. We are standing in solidarity with, and you can think about the standing in solidarity with. Imagine if something that happened in Minnesota after the shooting of Renee Good and John Pretty, and those solidarity rallies around the states, right? That came out, even though there were it happened in Minnesota. So these are really the way to look about it is solidarity, and the idea that Jewish Americans joined Israeli expats, right, in those solidarity rallies, in speaking on those rallies and so on, show basically how needed it was to get them invited to join those rallies. But rallies was just the beginning, because once the rally started, those community of liberal Jewish American with Israeli expats evolved to other things, right? And that are happening in different locations around North America, by the way, and also Australia and other places. And it's post October 7. I mean, it's changed a lot. It's changed a lot because of the nature of what's happened in Israel, right? So the pro-democracy rallies in Israel groups, right, was changing gears to do any civic help they can in Israel, right? I mean, think about it as the part of the neighboring. I think that Tom Friedman was talking about.
Yeah, the verb,
right?
the verb to neighbor to neighboring, yes.
Neighbor to neighboring, right? I mean, like, again, in Israel, everyone was basically said, like, okay, we are putting aside all the disagreements we have about anything, just to make sure that everyone has shelter, everyone has what they need to go to defend Israel, and so on and so on. And so does that UnXeptable group did, I mean, post October 7. And again, think about it, October 7 was basically Saturday in Israel, right? It's happened Saturday morning in Israel. And on the same night, it's supposed to be the 40-week protest night for the judicial overhaul. That's how crazy it is.
There was a segment on your website that I also was very moved by. The strength of a bridge is tested when the wind howls. Similarly, the bridges that Ofer and his team built among Israeli and Jewish communities and organizations around the world came under immense strain as October 7th upended life for all of them. So I look at that in terms of how it changed after October 7th, how the communities, though, that you built through that civil response, continued to support each other and continued to find ways to uphold each other.
And it's uphold each other, and then we had to uphold many more things, like again, like saving the hostages, and at some point later on, making sure that we know that saving the hostages is connected to ending the war. I mean, and we could, and the idea was that we could do all of that through the basic values of what we call liberal Zionism, right? I mean, like this is the founding fathers of Israel definition of like everyone has equality and everyone needs to be saved, and the sanctify of life is the most important thing. And that's what gave UnXeptable and others who joined us the ability to move the focus from saving Israeli democracy. I mean, I would say differently, redefining what's important right now under saving Israeli democracy, which was to save the hostages and end the war, and supporting Israel and again, I mean, the voices of what we called. And we felt very strongly that being pro-Israeli, right, is what it's important to be a part of pro-Israeli is to save the hostages and bring home the hostages and save Israel from ending the war.
And now that there is a ceasefire in Gaza, how has your focus changed? Has it gone back to what it was before October 7th, or has it changed again because of the Iranian war?
So the focus is never. I mean, probably 3 months after the war started. I mean, like we kept basically connecting the dots between how this government is acting and which is again trying to using the war in many ways to dismantle. To basically keep them in power, right? And once the hostage, and we kept doing what we called webinars and education session to keep the Jewish Americans in the picture of all the voices in Israel. Again, like many times you think that the voices in Israel are just what you hear in the Hasbara, what we called, is the information that comes from Israel. Many times it makes sense, many times it's not, but I mean, like it was definitely part of what the government of Israel tried to convey to the American people and the Jewish Americans. And so we did a lot of those. David is really focusing on translating a lot of content from Hebrew to English. And that focus stayed during, now the Iran war is in many ways the extension of what we call, it's like almost the 900 days since October 7th, right? So it's not necessarily a separate war, even though it's looked like a separate one. The focus is still like making sure that this war is fought for the right reasons and not being used for political gain.
And when you're
just to add to that point, it's not that the focus stayed the same because we couldn't change focus. The focus stayed the same because the Netanyahu government used these ongoing events and the wars in pursuit of the same goals. So, and we were often, it was our movement, others like us, who are the first to say, wait, what they're doing is not actually in service of security, but it's in service of the same aims, continuing the war beyond when almost every security expert in Israel said it had little additional value, and all kinds of other actions. So we were saying, hey, the judicial coup or the move towards authoritarianism hasn't stopped. In fact, sometimes it's gaining speed. So we can't sit on the sidelines and wait for this war or the next war or the next war to end to get back to political debate, because they are using it to entrench their power.
And I want to pick up on what you just said about security and safety. When you're looking at the stakes of the election coming up, you're looking at security, safeties, people's needs, hospitals being built, basic needs. You're also looking at cronyism, the challenges of the political folks that are using it to their advantage. How do you outline those concerns, those stakes? How do you outline them to folks so that they know what way to be thinking about the election coming up?
Well, Phil, you go ahead. So security is always the number one issue in Israeli elections. And there have been candidates and parties who've tried to say before October 7th, well, we've moved beyond and it's cost of living and so on, and they were never really successful in that sense. But essentially, what part of the effort of the continuing wars is to rack up a series of what the public will view as wins to kind of sweep away or push into the background the catastrophe of October 7th and the massive failure. Since October 7th, there has not been accountability. And so one of the big questions is, do we just look at what some of the public perceives as wins since then? Or do we get back to accountability for the greatest tragedy to befall Israel since its founding in 1948? So that is one of the big dividing lines. In traditional Israel, there would have been what we call a state commission of inquiry by now. And if it were like any other similar event in the past, the government would have been replaced. They hopefully would have resigned on their own, or they would have been forced out of power. The other big one you mentioned is what we call sharing the burden. This gets back to the coalition with the ultra-Orthodox, when a few yeshiva students were exempt from service so they could keep studying, and the numbers were small. Nobody really cared. We're now talking about a huge percentage of the population that doesn't serve, and often as a result is less active, does not work in the economy. And that's becoming too much to bear, especially when the portion of the public that does serve is asked to do more and more, especially in the form of reserve duty. So I think those will be the issues. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, if I missed.
And so again, I mean, it's all coming down to this notion that is kind of like separating many countries now. When you go to sliding to authoritarian, it's like the rule of law, right? I mean, like the idea that everyone agree on the same basics law concept of how do you choose government? I mean, like, and how do you make the elections, and what the checks and balances look like? And underneath that, I mean, like, we believe that, I mean, people will believe that security is coming through what David said. Like, when you have things that needs to be checked, then they're being checked and not being avoided. Like, again, so think about it as January 6th event, right? Some people still believe, even in America, that it didn't actually happen, or it wasn't an insurrectionist. It wasn't. So there is this divide between what we call pro-democracy and pro-authoritarianism, or whatever we want to call it. And so if you ask people in Israel, the divide will not be two-state solution or no two-state solution, right? That will not be the priority right now on this election, but it will be security
and safety.
And if two-state solution brings security, then it makes sense.
Yeah, and then to celebrate democracy through that as well. I'm going to need to take a break for our supportive commercials. We'll be back after just a few short commercials and learning more about UnXeptable. Want to make sure that I give the website, UnXeptable.org, unacceptable.org. Fascinating conversation, and we'll be continuing it in just a little while. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Connections Radio Show. I'm Laurie Fitz, your host of Connections Radio. Today we are continuing the series of Jewish Voices, and we've been featuring a movement group founded by Israeli expats here in the U.S. who are standing up to save democracy and human rights in Israel, and we're focusing on how ordinary citizens can come together and make a difference in the fight to preserve democracy, both here and Israel. We're very grateful to the efforts of Kit Bix, our producer of Jewish Voices. And we've been in conversation with John Orenstein, who is the co-chair of J Street, Minnesota, David Myers, who is a leader in UnXeptable. We also have Ophir Gutesen, who is the co-founder of UnXeptable, joining us. With that, I know that we ended with sort of a cliffhanger question, and I'd love to have you continue that question, John.
Yeah, thank you. We've heard a lot from Ophir and David about Israeli elections, why Israelis vote, whether there will be a change in leadership or not. But I want to ask sort of a provocative question from an American point of view, which is, what do we care? If the end result is likely to be there's a different leader, but not that much change in the policies that Americans care about, which are West Bank settlement, Gaza peace, justice in the region toward Israelis and Palestinians alike. If those things aren't what's driving Israelis on their votes, what do we care how the election comes out?
Sure, I can start with that. I think the simple answer, and we recognize that this set of issues is of great concern to the listeners and to many in the United States. And it may be disappointing that if you ask Israelis, well, how important is it to you that there be a Palestinian state, or do you approve a two-state solution? There's not huge enthusiasm. But when the same question is asked in the frame of resolving Israel's security problems and safety for them, it becomes something that is much more of interest. I will also say that the latest wave of violence has started to wake up even the quiet public in Israel, saying this is not who we are, both from an ethical, moral perspective and also from a rule of law perspective, that a small group of thugs, hooligans, violent extremist groups and individuals are able to essentially run wild, and that the government and that the police don't treat that as a threat. That is starting to raise some resistance. But even given the fact that the Israeli public may not have the same ambitions as some people here around the plight, let's say, of the Palestinians, the overlap in the results can't be missed. If this current government continues, not only is it held really in the hands of extremists who want to take this much, much further towards annexation and suppression of the Palestinians, but they're also moving towards an authoritarian theocratic state that doesn't really care about its own people. And what that means is that in Israel, under this regime, is willing to endure embargoes, sanctions, all kinds of things for their messianic vision. They've even said, well, we'll be kind of a Sparta. We'll just be here fighting, and if our standard of living goes down, that's okay. If we can't travel around the world, that's fine. A liberal democratic government will not see things that way and is more susceptible to managing these competing interests of both what people would like territorially, politically, and Israel's place in the world. So it's of huge interest that Israel be a liberal democracy exactly for those goals that you mentioned.
Just for our listeners' benefit, there will be elections this year. There's no doubt about that. Is that right?
That's right. The elections are set for October 27 this year, so very close to the elections in the U.S. And it could come much, much earlier. And
does the Iranian war that we're all in the middle of impact that? Is there a chance that it might not?
So basically one of the assumptions was that starting this war at that time, again, the threat was there. There is no question about it. But when do you start it? How do you start it? How long does it take? It has, again, going back to the basics question you asked me in the beginning of the show. Mm-hmm. I mean, we have an indicted prime minister who we know that he's trying to run from his trial and making this very crucial decision about the state of Israel and the region. And that's where the question was, like, does this war going to impact the polls and maybe get the election earlier than what it's supposed to be? Because in Israel, you can basically you can dissolve the government and go in 3 months to elections in this system. So far, any poll since the war has not changed anything between the two camps, the coalition camp and the opposition camp. If there is any, there is actually just stay the same, which means it's show back to the point of David made that the people of Israel, the majority of the people of Israel, were kind of like distinguishing themselves with what we call, we are not our government. The action of the government does not represent us. It was true when in the Gaza war, and when, again, we heard words from people in the government that was talking about flattening Gaza and revenge and all those other things, and all the way now over here. And I would just add on John's point, if that's okay.
1 point, 30 seconds. Go for it.
What we can do from here and why it's important from us here is that this is a crucial election, not just for Israelis, it's a crucial election to anyone who considers Israel as a Jewish homeland. And that means that Jews around the world. And there is many ways you can get involved in doing that by basically thinking about grassroots activities in Israel that are focusing on voter turnout, voter intimidation, safeguarding the election the same way as you do in America. You can help that. And when you save Israeli democracy, you're basically able to fix other problems that are really, really important to all of us here.
And you can learn more about UnXeptable by going to unexceptable.org.